Hello, everybody. Good evening. I'll raise that up a bit. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Benjamin Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers here in Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory, which is the land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. As we listen to our speakers share their words today, may we recognize the Indigenous stories that have been shared on this land since time immemorial. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Revisions, edited by Wendy Roy. Thank you so much to Wendy and all of our contributors for being here this evening and for working with us to make this event happen. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam over here. I'd also like to take this time to encourage you to silence your phones for the duration of the event. If you'd like to buy a copy of Revisions, we have some up here on the signing table behind me, as well as on the table by where you first walked in. You're welcome to get your book signed. We just please ask that you pay for it if you do. Thank you. So, editor Wendy Roy is Bateman Professor of English at the University of Saskatchewan. Her current research is on dystopian and apocalyptic literature in Canada. She is the author of the next installment, Serials, Sequels, and Adaptations of Nellie L. McClung, Ella Montgomery, and Maison de la Roche, and Maps of Indifference, Canada, Women, and Travel. She co-edited Listening Up, Writing Down, and Looking Beyond, Interfaces of the Oral, Written, and Visual. Without further ado, please give Wendy a warm welcome.
So thank you to all of you for coming to celebrate the launch of the edited collection Revisions, Speculating in Literature and Film in Canada, including, of course, everyone watching on video link. And of course, my deep appreciation to Benjamin and McNally Robinson for hosting this event, and also to the University of Toronto Press, which published the book, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the University of Saskatchewan Department of English for supporting the research and publication of this volume. As you can see from all of us sitting up here, a collection such as this one is a collaborative effort. There are, in fact, 19 contributors to Revisions, Speculating in Literature and Film in Canada, 20 if you count the cover artist, and contributions include an interview with a speculative fiction practitioner, 3 creative or creative critical contributions, and 15 scholarly essays. I'd like first to introduce the collection and its goals by reading from the beginning and end of the introduction, and then welcome some of the contributors, the ones who are up here with me today, to talk for a few minutes about their contributions. And then we're going to open it up for questions and comments. So from the introduction. In the painting The Plastic Age by Iris Hauser that serves as the cover image and frontispiece for this volume, a solitary figure stands on an apocalyptic hillside, wearing, holding, and surrounded by multiple items of plastic debris, bags, water jugs, plumbing pipe, even a discarded hot water bottle. The person featured demonstrates in a visceral way the destructive force that humans have on the natural environment. At the same time, the rocky yellow rise and the blue sky streaked by clouds have an eerie beauty, and the figure stands strong and tall, head held high, gazing into the distance. The focus on vision and distance in Iris's painting is particularly appropriate for this study, because the concepts of the speculative and of speculation, and of envisioning and revisioning are at the heart of this collection of essays and creative works. During the global pandemic that began in late 2019, the value of speculative fiction, film, and television became acutely evident. The health crisis demonstrated that the contemporary world can be a terrifying and isolating place. Through Canadian pandemic novels and television series such as Salima Nawaz's Songs for the End of the World, and the adaptation of Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, the crisis also showed that speculative writing and other forms of art can help us to sort out complex uncertainties about ourselves, others, and the world around us in an empathetic and considered way. Works of speculation can provide a humanistic perspective on issues such as health catastrophes, climate change, pollution, and technological innovation that cannot be considered only from scientific perspectives because they have enormous significance for us all as human beings. Such creations are of value to their audiences for what they illuminate about possible future human experiences. At the same time, these works can be used by their creators to represent and to speculate on current and past social issues, such as relations of class, gender, and race, as well as issues of health, safety, environmental destruction, economic upheaval, and political conflict. For this reason, speculative writing in Canada has become a tool to interrogate colonial systems and histories, and to open up spaces for members of often marginalized groups, including women, Indigenous peoples, and members of 2S LGBTQ+ communities. These works can help us to see what is happening in the world around us, and at the same time, to re-envision it, to understand the consequences of our actions, and to imagine revised and perhaps better alternatives. Re-envision, Speculating in Literature and Film in Canada, focuses especially on dystopian and apocalyptic works that speculate about the future and at the same time provide a commentary on the present and the past. I'm just going to turn to the end where I talk at the end a bit about the origins of the book. This volume had its origins in a conference held virtually in 2021. And while some of the contributions reflect on the circumstances around that gathering, they go far beyond what occurred there. Called 2021 Vision, Speculating in Literature and Film in Canada, the conference was postponed from 2020, when it was to be called 2020 Vision, and it was held, and it was also supposed to have been held in person at the University of Saskatchewan. So it was postponed and a year, and then it was moved online as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. An ongoing contemporary worldwide health catastrophe had an enormous effect on the conference and the kinds of exchanges and collaborations that it could encompass. The results weren't all negative, though, since while we could not come together in person to exchange ideas, scholars and writers from a much wider geographical area were able to attend and participate, including Canadian practitioners of speculative writing such as Cherie Dimaline, Salima Nawaz, Marlene Goldman, and Wade Compton. The interchanges that resulted were productive, exciting, and yet limited to what could be expressed through a video conferencing platform. The interview with Dimaline that is featured in this collection was conducted after the conference, but was inspired by some of the concepts and interchanges in her keynote address, especially her argument that Indigenous speculative writing works to reveal, to interrupt, and to recenter complex events, processes, and peoples in the past and present. Several of the essays and creative works in this volume are revised and expanded versions of papers presented at the conference, but others were conceived and written specifically for the collection. While the global pandemic fundamentally altered the nature of the conference, it also helped to underscore the goals of both the conference and this volume. Occurring shortly after the 2021 uncovering of unmarked graves of Indigenous children at former residential schools, which had been known of but not located for decades, the conference and its keynote addresses highlighted the fundamental importance of speculative writing by Indigenous authors that both reveals the past and reimagines the future. It emphasized, as does this collection, the ways that speculative writing can help to recenter and re-envision broader histories and futures in or relating to Canada. It helped us to see that as we stand on a metaphoric dystopian hillside that reveals the devastating impact of our relationships and activities, we can still look into the distance with purpose, hope, and conviction in a way that exposes and critiques colonial and gendered power structures, and at the same time celebrates the power of diversity and of collaboration. So that's the beginning here. And now I'm just going to introduce the contributors one at a time, kind of more or less in alphabetical order, not entirely. The first contributor is Mabiana Camargo. Mabiana was instrumental in this project. She helped with research. She was co-organizer of the conference. And for the collection, she interviewed Cherie Demeline, the well-known author of The Marrow Thieves and Hunting by Stars. She also contributed her own essay called Gender Oppression Through Enclosed Spaces in Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. So Mabiana is a scholar from Brazil. She's also a final year PhD candidate at the University of Saskatchewan, where she's researching women's bodies and enclosed spaces in Margaret Atwood's speculative fiction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roy, for the kind words and for your introduction. First of all, I would like to say that it was a great pleasure to be part of this project, and I am honored to be in this collection with many other researchers and scholars. Some of them are here, my colleagues. Yeah, it has been a great treat. As Dr. Roy mentioned, I have 2 chapters in the revisions collection. My first chapter is the interview with Métis author Cherie Demeline. And this interview was based on her keynote address at the 2021 Vision Conference that was held at the University of Saskatchewan, and it happened during the pandemic. So this interview had a different format because it happened during the pandemic. So it was done digitally. So we exchange ideas via email. The title of this interview is Interrupting the Fire with Stories, which is a term by Demeline that she means it is interrupting colonial oppression. So it's a term she coined. And my other chapter is on Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. And in this chapter, I focus on ideas of space and gender. And particularly, I see how female characters are usually oppressed through enclosure. So they can be metaphorically imprisoned or physically. And I'm going to read a fragment of my chapter now. Excuse me. As a speculative trilogy, Mad Adam explores how technology and climate crisis might impact humanity's future, while questioning our present social, political, and economic organizations and systems. Atwood's novels encourage discussions of gender relations in a capitalist society through female characters whose lack of spatial possibilities exemplifies their subjugation. In this chapter, I focus primarily on the dystopian past timeline of Atwood's trilogy, as depicted in Oryx and Crake and the Year of the Flood. And I analyze how Atwood's female characters, Oryx, Toby, and Wren, are confined to enclosed spaces and have limited mobility. These characters live in a social zone of exclusion, built upon ideas about their bodies that are aligned with and concretized by the materiality of physical spaces. Each location exemplifies the asymmetrical power relations between men and women, with the women usually under male control and or suffering gendered abuse. Through the female characters' movement in space, or even the lack of it, ideas about women's bodies, sexuality, and behavior are reinforced, determining their social roles and identities. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabiana, for for talking about your part of the collection. And now I'm going to turn to Jessica McDonald, who's a university lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan, and she was formerly a postdoctoral research fellow at Simon Fraser University. She researches Canadian literature in relation to social and environmental justice, and she's published on Nalo Hopkinson, Michael Crummey, and Douglas Copeland. The latter is the focus of her current book manuscript, Complicated Geographies, Douglas Copeland's North America. Jessica will be talking about her essay in the collection, Small Acts of Urban Placemaking in Nalo Hopkinson's Skin Folk.
Once you get up here, it's a little scarier. Hi. Thank you so much, Wendy, obviously for editing this collection, also for being my mentor and friend for the last almost 20 years, actually. I was figuring that out today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, all of the folks who are up here, are also my friends. And I think that covers it. Yeah, McNally, everybody, everyone. So as Wendy mentioned, I'm going to read from my chapter, Small Acts of Urban Placemaking in Nalo Hopkinson's Skin Folk, a little bit from the intro, a little bit from the conclusion, in fact, the last paragraph. In the foreword to her 2015 short story collection, Falling in Love with Hominids, Nalo Hopkinson writes, quote, "I see the ways in which science fiction is too often used to confirm people's complacency, to reassure them that it's okay for them not to act, because they are not the lone superhero who will fix the world's ills. And yet," she continues, "humanity as a whole is not satisfied with complacency, nor, I add, is humanity changed by it." Hopkinson's foreword tacitly frames the aims of her collection as corrective, directed towards what she envisions as this conundrum of the genre. The relationship between the foreword and the text proper, the problem of complacency, and the stories offered in response are exemplary of Hopkinson's fiction in Hominids and beyond. In its keen attention to the small, everyday, individual acts of its characters, despite the global and extraordinary conditions in which those characters live, Hopkinson's writing replaces complacency as a familiar and affective readerly output of science fiction with agency. Most crucially for this chapter, Hopkinson's stories demonstrate the power of individual agency to shape urban space, even and especially spaces that seem out of the scope of individuals' influence. The spaces I refer to here have been deemed by anthropologist Marc Auger the non-places of supermodernity: shopping malls and chain stores, buses and streets, airports and trains, hotels, banks, food courts, and other sites whose functions depend on the logistics of transport, transit, commerce, and leisure. These geographies of the everyday, as Catherine McKittrick calls them, are often seen as not really places at all, and are normally undermined, McKittrick argues. Ignored, dismissed, made almost invisible, even if they are ubiquitous. These are sites that can seem so structurally, systemically established that they appear to be an inevitable background of supermodernity, unchangeable by individual hands. But of course, this understanding, with Auger's theory alongside it, does not account for how individual bodies and identities can yield different experiences of the same space, nor does it leave room for how individuals can and do produce these spaces in creative and disruptive ways. So in contrast to that whole way of thinking, Hopkinson's speculative fiction advocates for the strong possibilities of placemaking in contemporary urban geographies many see as ever more placeless, especially as they are marked by relations of transaction, such as between the shopper and the shop or the passenger in the streetcar. Her writerly commitment to geographical agency is therefore the motivating force of my chapter, which studies these qualities in her debut short story collection, Skin Folk. Skin Folk foregrounds the power of the individual and of relations between individuals to turn anonymous urban spatiality into community, or non-place into place. So then the bulk of my chapter is looking at those three stories, so in the ways that I just described. And I just want to read the very last paragraph here to kind of close this out. In the call for papers circulated for this collection, Wendy Roy asks, "Which visions of Canada do we find in speculative texts?" Hopkinson's stories answer this question with pragmatic optimism based on the will and actions of dynamic individuals. To answer Roy's question, I see how Nalo Hopkinson's speculative stories share essential knowledge about Canada's futures. The vision of Canada found in her writing is one in which social, cultural, and material geographies can be transformed, and people along with them. This vision relies on the lift of agency over the drag of complacency, It demands the deliberate practice of awareness, not the fog of inattention. This vision can emerge astonishingly from the accumulation of single moments like we see in her stories, the touch of hands, a conversation, quiet care for another's safety, meals shared between unexpected companions. Most crucially, this vision is premised on a persistent commitment to small, everyday acts of community making, because it is these that subtly but powerfully shape our geographic lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And so our next speaker just had eye surgery or cataract surgery, so I'm getting used to glasses. Our next speaker is Kai McKenzie. Kai is an advocate for gender diversity and a lecturer in literature and gender studies. They have doctoral degrees in folklore and English literature, the latter of which focuses on transgender, two-spirit, and other gender diverse literatures in Canada. Kai is going to talk about their contribution to revisions, like The Voice of a Mad Angel, Hungry Ghosts in Kai Cheng Tom's Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, a dangerous trans girl's confabulous memoir.
I also want to thank Wendy, and most of it, we're all her students and have benefited from her gifts of nurture, former. And so we are a community here, but we've all benefited from Wendy's amazing nurturing form of scholarship and care. And speaking of the COVID time, I do remember how strange it was to be TAing for your apocalyptic fiction class when the events in the world themselves were so, it wasn't an other kind of, dynamic we were talking about. So it was a different kind of experience. My chapter came out of my own personal experience as a non-binary person and the parent of a transgender child and a non-binary child in Colorado. I was trying to advocate for my children, and we were constantly excluded. And there was a constant discomfort with even talking about transgender people. I couldn't get my children's teachers to ever mention trans issues, and that was infuriating to me because I thought it was really inhuman to have children in your classroom and refuse to talk about them. You're teaching stigma and shame. And so ultimately I just, I kind of burned out with rage, and I decided I was going to try to come to Canada and study transgender and two-spirit literature and find a way out. And so my chapter is very personal. And I found that the novel Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, a dangerous trans girl's confabulous memoir by Kai Cheng Tom deals with exactly that. And the fantastical nature of it is a way of helping it's loosely autobiographical, so it's also based on real life experience, helping the author figure out how to deal with rage, the rage that results from transphobia and exclusion, and having that stigma and shame attached to you. And so the protagonist in the novel internalizes that stigma in forms of basically haunting. It's a haunted landscape. Her own body is a site of haunting, and she's internalized the sense of stigma. But she's also a Chinese Canadian, and it's a really interesting fusion of Chinese heritage and European heritage in this kind of diasporic landscape of hungry ghosts. It's based on the Chinese Hungry Ghost Festival, in which the idea is that an ancestral figure failed to offer care and food to somebody, and so they weren't able to rest after death, and the figure of the starving ghost who can't get enough food and haunts the landscape. And during the festival in August, the ghosts are fed. And so the story itself, ultimately, it's about this kind of hungry ghost landscape. The protagonist's childhood house was like a hungry ghost eating her alive before she escaped to the city of smoke and lights, this fantastical place where she's able to meet other trans women. Now, in this space, interestingly enough, that when she does go to this fantastical, escape her oppressive home and end up in this fantastical place, she encounters a whole collection of fantastical transgender goddess-like femmes. And they really are expressive of kind of monstrous feminine. And I find it fascinating that we tend to other trans women, but in this sense, the monstrous feminine is really an expression, continuation of the European cultural history of the monstrous feminine, the way the representations of feminine monstrosity, terrifying creatures who are part woman and part animal, who haunt the midst of the ancient world and express masculine-centered cultural fears that contain women within a patriarchal and repressive frame. The Sphinx with a face and breasts of a woman, a lion's body and the wings of a bird, the Gorgons, winged women with hair made of living snakes, which could turn and devour men. And so the idea is that the kind of stigma attached to trans women is actually a kind of expression of the stigma attached to all women. It's just a larger form of it. So interestingly, in this landscape of haunting is a place that can kind of access the psychological dimension of rage and turn it around. Ultimately, this group of trans women goes they become the lipstick lacerators and go after the violent men who are persecuting them after one of their own is murdered and tossed in a dumpster in this act of vengeance. But ultimately, it also just threatens to destroy them. And so the question again is, how do we deal psychologically with rage? And in the end, the protagonist learns to turn to healing and forgiveness. Like she exhausts, the rage is ultimately spent. And she turns to healing in the form of a forgiveness cake, which when she's stirring, it's like stirring the forces of the universe. And the smells go out into the landscape and end up creating a healing power in a way that I think is interestingly similar to the way that the incense and the food heals the hungry ghosts in the Hungry Ghost Festival. But ultimately, the whole landscape is haunted, and haunting is a site of both, expressive of the rage, but also the site of possible transformation. And the other really interesting thing about it is the issue of the mutuality of abjection, the way the trans person who's been victimized becomes equally monstrous with the cisgender men who are victimizing them. And they're kind of caught up in this mutual relationship. I'm just going to read briefly from the kind of concluding paragraph. Ghosts in Tom's novel represent affective relational tensions, parental hunger in the form of the hungry house, transphobia that manifests as swarming bees, and the spirit of the dead cop, and foundational trauma as the hungry ghosts of murdered trans women. Foundational support arrives as ancestral spirit power through the soft touches of ghost friend, the fierce and tender anchoring love of first femme, the power of language to work change through stories, and the affective power to shift perspectives, which results from the transformational energy of the forgiveness cake. In each case, ghostly abilities to diffuse, transform, get past surface layers and into the core of problems, generate opportunities to rework relationships and find new planes and platforms for healing. The blending of memoir and speculative fiction allows the trans protagonist and Tom's readers vicariously to open up their own lives, probe the dark and difficult, twisted and knotted spaces resulting from the transphobic pressures of the cis-centric world, and release new kinds of hope and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. And so our next speaker is Mackenzie Reid. Mackenzie is an independent scholar whose main area of research is American feminist television series and films. She's a curriculum writer and educator at Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies, and she's an academic strategist with the University of Saskatchewan. She's going to be talking a bit about her essay, Vision and Revisioning in The Handmaid's Tale and Two Adaptations.
I have to say, and I probably shouldn't, but I wasn't embarrassed until my skirt fell down in the parking lot. And now I'm very nervous. But I see lots of friendly faces in the crowd, so thank you so much for coming. I'd like to thank Wendy Roy for all her hard work and guidance in helping me focus on an idea that started in her Women of the Apocalypse course at the University of Saskatchewan in 2018. I was interested in adaptations of The Handmaid's Tale, but little did I know that I would be adapting that essay for a conference paper and then adapting it again into a chapter. So it's very meta for me. It's an honor to be included on this panel and in this collection of fine scholarship. And thank you all for being here. That means a lot to me. My chapter explores Adrienne Rich's notion, or feminist notion, of revision. Quote, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction, is for women more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. Until we can understand the assumptions in which we are drenched, we cannot know ourselves. And this drive to self-knowledge is for women more than a search for identity. It is part of our refusal of the self-destructiveness of male-dominated society, end quote. I was just going to say that the Canadian scholar Linda Hutchins, she's incredible. She argues that adaptations are like revisioning, or she says that adaptations are repetition, but repetition without replication. And so I argue that adaptations work similarly to Adrienne Rich's notion of revision because they take an original text and imbue it with new meaning. When done well, an adaptation can extend an original text's powerful storytelling and help us to better understand ourselves, the world, and its complexities here and now. I make my case by analyzing how the matters of looking and being looked at are handled in Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, the 1990 film by the same name, and most recently, the Handmaid's Tale television series. In the novel, the gaze is incredibly important because there are very real and sometimes deadly consequences to looking and being looked at in a totalitarian state. Throughout the narrative, the protagonist, Offred, addresses the complexities of being watched by the military, not so subtly known as the Eyes, her commander, his wife Serena Joy, and the staff working in the Waterford home. Outside of the home, Offred, along with the other handmaids, is forced to wear a winged cap that obscures her vision in the same fashion as horse blinders. Obviously, limited vision and the omnipresent threat of being watched are essential themes to The Handmaid's Tale. And here's where my nerves really get me. Despite this, Offred is at times a voyeur herself, whether that's when she gains access to the commander's study, where under his watch, she can read and play Scrabble, or when she's taken to the clandestine nightclub called Jezebel's, where she's able to reunite with her best friend, or in her own imagination, where she often meditates on being the observer. Vision, and by extension, point of view, are essential themes to The Handmaid's Tale. And as a result, some critics have argued that to film The Handmaid's Tale is to extend Gilead's totalitarian gaze as the camera functions as a sort of surveillance device. To quote critic Pamela Cooper, to film The Handmaid's Tale is to extend the threatening strategies of visual surveillance that persecute the women in the narrative. It is to force the audience's complicity by the inherent voyeurism of movie watching with the invasive examining of the disenfranchised by the dictatorial which the novel portrays. While I agree that the camera can act as a tool of surveillance, it's not the camera itself that's the problem, but how it is used. The 1990 film and the television series approach this problem in very different ways, with one adaptation being far more superior, in my humble opinion. To find out which adaptation, you will need to read my chapter. But I'll conclude by saying that both the filmed adaptations contribute to the patchwork quilt of meaning by revisioning The Handmaid's Tale. And they offer us the opportunity to do our own revisioning of the stories we read, we watch, and we experience in these politically fraught times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. And our next speaker is Jasmine Redford. Jasmine's a comics illustrator and a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan, whose academic research is on violence in Canadian comics. She has degrees in visual arts and English literature, and she is the artist for the graphic novel Siegfried Dragonslayer from 2022. Jasmine? Sorry. I want to say, and her essay is about comics in Station 11, Other Worlds Within Other Worlds, Comics World Building and Identity Formation in Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11.
Oh, thank you very much. Just let me arrange myself here. I'd just like to thank everyone on the panel. It's full of mentors and just wonderful, wonderful classmates I've had over the years. And they keep letting me get away with writing on comics, so I shall continue to do so. So in Emily St. John Mandel's novel, Station 11, we have a book where the planet has been just completely ravaged by a catastrophic influenza pandemic, which kills 99% of the world's population. There are survivors that we follow, trudging their way through the post-apocalyptic landscape, which is effectively and entirely a new world. One of the protagonists, Kristen, carries remnants of the old world around with her, one of which is an independently produced science fiction comic book called Dr. 11, which features a Doctor Who-like character called Dr. 11. The book's generally agreed upon protagonist, Tyler, also remembers this comic from the before times, and he adores it. He even worships it. Think of obsessed fan. And they both, in different ways, use this niche, independently produced, small print run vanity press project, the comic, as an identity forming and world building device. And I find it personally fascinating how people can form their entire identity on disposable media and so-called low art, things that seem entirely unscholarly, unserious, or unimportant, for lack of better terms, on so-called social junk. Yeah. What do you call it? Like guilty pleasures, comics, tabloids, etc. But they are still cultural objects. And personally, I was immediately drawn to the comic that's in the novel, that's repeatedly described in the book, that we never get to see because it's a book. We don't get to see this comic that the characters fixate on. And if there's no one here who knows someone who has built their identity around a brand, a series, a franchise, a sports team, or a character that they've hyper-fixated on in their entire life, it's probably you or someone you know. So these disposable items, these franchises, these guilty pleasures, these items, and for me it was the comic in Station 11, holds so much power because not only are the survivors of this post-pandemic apocalypse holding on to these items for nostalgic reasons and as ties to the world that once existed, they're also using them in a way as educational material, comics and stories that help them to make sense of the world that they actually do live in now. I'll just read a small fragment from my contribution to the volume. By acknowledging that world building, the development of an imaginary world or universe complete with its own fictive history, is not simply a creative leisure activity that leads to speculative franchise opportunities. Mandel uses the comic as an apparatus for her characters, specifically Kristen and Tyler, to create their new lived realities. The novel posits that so-called disposable media and art forms identified in the novel as comics and Star Trek episodes and tabloid magazines, and broken pieces of old musical instruments are not simply pieces of nostalgia, but instead they are the cornerstones of contemporary and future personal and cultural identity. Historically, comics offer a look into a fantastic and sometimes melancholy pocket universe whose themes comment on contemporary issues or that anticipate future problems in the world in which they were authored. The efforts of the novel's characters demonstrate that it is the collectors of media who preserve and influence history. Disposable media that have been assigned more value as they age, such as Star Trek merchandise or comics that were kept in good condition, eventually find their way into the hands of personal collectors, and then, after that, museums. And there is an irony implicit in world building insofar as it is often the disadvantaged and the young who create these new worlds and thus formulate new values for the later generations to build upon, even off of silly things. Similarly, comics that are not appreciated in their own time then become the seed of the central narrative for a whole new world in this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. The next contributor who's going to talk is Gwen Rose. Gwen is a doctoral student at the University of Saskatchewan. Her main areas of research are literary modernism and the lived experience of oppressed and marginalized peoples. These are combined in her dissertation, which examines transgender characters within modernist fiction. So Gwen's going to speak about their contribution, Indigenous resurgence and resistance in Cherie Dimeline's The Marrow Thieves and Hunting by Stars.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. Thanks for having me. Thanks for including me in this collection, and thanks to all of my colleagues and co-contributors here. Thanks for everyone who's here as well. So in Cherie Dimeline's The Marrow Thieves and Hunting by Stars, like it's a work of speculative fiction, right? And in many such works, technology is often framed as sort of utopic or helpful. But in these works, it's actually a near dystopian fiction in which technology has ruined the world, right? And Dimeline is very careful to position sort of these effects, these technological disasters that have resulted in a ruined ecosystem and a damaged world as very close to our own, right? The like oil disasters, the pipeline bursts and ruins the Great Lakes, for example. We can imagine that happening in our own world. In the sequel, Hunting by Stars, that came out and was written during the pandemic. It came out during the pandemic. She even manages to work an epidemic into that as well, to sort of work that into the storyline, even though that wasn't part of The Marrow Thieves, which was issued and written and published before the pandemic. It's all part of her efforts to sort of implicate settler colonialism and the technological impetus that exists within our industrialized society, essentially, as one of the villains in the story, right? So that's the setting. And in this setting, in a ruined world, we also have a scenario where most people have lost the ability to dream, except for Indigenous people in Turtle Island. And by itself, there's nothing inherently harmful with that. But then immediately, of course, right, the settler colonial people in this novel, and the settler colonial society in these novels has set out to say, we need to get there. They're so desperate to get back the ability to dream that they begin rounding up Indigenous people across the continent and harvesting the marrow in their bones, which reinvigorates them temporarily with the ability to dream. That's where the title comes from, The Marrow Thieves, right? So we have dystopian forces which are explicitly linked to technology. And when I talk about Indigenous resurgence in these novels, that's what's in opposition to this, right? Resurgence is a concept theorized by the Indigenous Anishinaabe writer Leanne Betasama Simpson. And in Simpson's theoretical works, resurgence essentially is everything that Indigenous people are and what they do that existed before colonialism, that existed before contact, right? Traditional practices, traditional language, traditional ways of knowing and living. And in Simpson's nonfiction work, she always is talking about how Indigenous people, of course, live in a world now in Turtle Island where they engage with society. But she says these ideas of resurgence aren't about engaging with settler society. They're about everything that Indigenous people are completely outside of settler society. So again, traditional practices, hunting, knowing, harvesting, language, storytelling, stories, oral traditions. That's her idea of what this is. And in The Marrow Thieves and Hunting by Stars, I see these ideas come into play, right? The protagonist of the novel is a young Métis teenager. And he's running away from the recruiters. These are the settler colonial, essentially police force. It's very ICE-like, actually, who are rounding up Indigenous peoples and putting them into so-called schools where their marrow is then harvested. The schools is obviously a reference to residential schools as well. So he's on the run, and he meets other Indigenous people who are also sort of on the run from these recruiters, they're called. And it's a sort of story of found family, right? But it's these resurgent practices that are in opposition to settler colonialism here in these works, right? When they're out hunting and he sees a moose, for example, but chooses not to kill it because he knows, oh, our group can't harvest that properly. We can't use all of what this animal is. We can't stop to smoke this meat for 2 days before moving on because we're on the move. So he chooses not to hunt the animal, even though it would be of value. Or when they stop to tell stories with each other, right? The family stops and tells each other their stories. They tell stories of one of their elders tells origin stories as well, but they also tell their own personal stories. They're sharing this with each other. They're sharing these resurgent practices with each other. And this is what's the act of resistance in these novels, not going out and fighting back explicitly against forces far more powerful and numerous than their own, but practices that exist outside of that and just saying, who are we? Can we get back to who we are, even in the face of a damaged world? And as it turns out, that's a force for resistance in the novels. When one of their elders is captured by the recruiters and she starts speaking in Anishinaabe, that wrecks their technology, that wrecks the marrow extraction technology. And that's what sort of ends up, that's a little speculative, right? That this would work in this way. That's not what matters, is the exact mechanisms of it. What matters in these novels isn't exactly why Indigenous people have retained the ability to dream, where others have not. It's, again, just that idea that by getting back to who they are and being true to themselves, connecting with the land in a way that has lost, right? When you look at a territory that is ruined by oil spills and so on, you see a group of people, settler colonial people, who have lost the ability to connect with the land. And Indigenous people are positioned in opposition to that in these novels. I have talked for too long. I'm gonna stop. That's the basic premise of my piece. Read it if you want, or read my much smarter friends' pieces. Stop talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. So the last contributor that I'm going to introduce is Iris Hauser. So Iris is a well-known Saskatoon artist who's taught workshops at galleries across Western Canada and through the University of Saskatchewan Certificate of Art and Design. Her paintings have been exhibited nationally and collected by the Saskatchewan Arts Board, the Canada Council Art Bank, the University of Saskatchewan, the University of Regina, the Reme Modern, and the Man Art Galleries. And she was recently a finalist for the 2025 Kingston Prize, Canada's national portrait competition. So Iris.
Thank you much, Wendy. Thanks for the lovely introduction and also for including me in this event.
So I'm going to ask Iris a couple of questions. So I've known Iris and her work for many years. And when I was planning the conference and then the collection, my first thought in relation to illustration was Iris's 2009 painting, The Plastic Age, which I was already familiar with, actually. I just thought it was absolutely perfect for both the conference and the collection. And I've already talked a bit about my interpretation of it and how it is related in some ways to the collection itself. But I want to end this formal part by asking Iris two questions about the painting. First of all, do you consider The Plastic Age now and when you were painting it, do you consider it a speculative work, especially one that asks us to think about a dystopian future and perhaps present? And also, secondly, is there also some hopefulness inherent in the painting?
Thank you, Wendy. Well, the short answer to both questions is yes and yes. I shall elaborate a little bit beyond that, however. Yes, this is a very good question, because that's exactly what the painting is about. Its title is The Plastic Age. And I chose that because the word plastic has two meanings. And the painting has two meanings as well. And the first obvious meaning of plastic is the material plastic, the debris that we filled our world with, to the extent where the fish we eat have microfibers in their flesh. Mother's milk has plastic in it. I mean, we've fouled the earth and the water horribly with this terribly destructive thing. It's awful. It's a totally apocalyptic disaster with what we've done with polluting the world. So it's a very negative thing in my mind. It's very hard to get away from plastic, and it's everywhere. and it will be with us even if we stop producing it for centuries to come. It's something that the future will have to live with. And we've just carelessly and thoughtlessly done that without really any consideration for people to come. So that's definitely there. And the painting was actually, the landscape was actually, I went down to the city dump and took that as my background. And Wendy described it beautifully in the introduction. I think she really read the painting well. And so it does have that environmental critique in it. But it also has the other meaning of plastic, which is malleable, something that can be formed and changed. And to me, that's why the plastic age, because young people are very plastic. They can change, they can adapt. And they didn't know the world before. They only know the world that they've come into. This is the world they've inherited. It is kind of a wreck, but they're going to have to move forward and make life from the debris that we've left for them. And that is very much, her outfit is all made of garbage that you would find, plastic things. But it's got a certain style to it. And as Wendy said, she's standing proud and looking to the future. And so to me, that's that hopefulness that as bad as things are, we're a very adaptable species, and the young can change the world, they can change themselves, and they can adapt. And so I always feel there's a certain hope. As bad as things are, we'll somehow learn to maneuver around it. So in answer to your question, yes, there is hope, as well as the apocalyptic disaster that we brought upon ourselves. So thank you very much for including me. I really appreciate being part of this. And I think Wendy's done a marvelous job in both the symposium and in putting this book together. It's a huge, huge effort. And I really thank her for doing it.
Thank you to all the contributors. I have so much enjoyed working with all of them, and I really appreciate them all coming out tonight as well. All the Saskatoon contributors are here, basically. So thank you very much. And I think we have about 5 minutes for questions and comments from the audience, which I'll just, you can address any or all of us.
Do you want to, I can bring the microphone to here.
Yeah, it was no, actually, because if you could speak into the microphone for the
Just for the
Oh,
live.
yes, right, of course. Okay. Well, first of all, I really like to say that it's wonderful to listen to all of your ideas. Amazing thoughts about literature, and I wanted to know, when I read this book, if I could have a conversation with you, how I would do that. Like if you were to include some kind of way of contacting you so that we could have a dialogue based on my understanding of it. I thought that would be really
spare room.
And actually, I'm readily available. Like my email addresses and phone number are there on the University of Saskatchewan website. So you can contact me, and then I can contact. A lot of other people have theirs are also available too. So
yes. Well, thank you. Also, I wanted to ask Iris about the scars that are present from the way that the world has been plasticized, and I just felt like that was the most grounded way that I felt all the hope that you all presented. It felt like, the plasticity of the peoples is hopeful. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, are there any other questions or comments?
Must be frustrating. I don't know. Wow.
You letting us off easy.
Guess you guys explained it all pretty well. So. Okay.
Oh, are there any questions of the contributors for each other?
Good job.
So for you, I just noticed that I don't know why I didn't notice this sooner, especially my focus on LGBTQ topics, but I just noticed the sock. And that it's under the veil, kind of like, why was your choice about putting it under veil? You could have put it on forearm or something like that. So what was that? What was the thinking there?
Well, sorry. It's for those of you who haven't seen the book. She's got the rainbow socks on, as to sort of represent a little bit. But it's transparent. You can see it, but there is a barrier. That's true, and I think that is just a function of society. That I think people tend to distance themselves from something that is different. And so I think you need, for her, a shield to protect herself and a little bit of a barrier, but yet still visibly there. So I hope that answers you.
Yeah, it was interesting to me that I hadn't noticed it before.
Ah.
A little tidbit for you. That's why.
I was just gonna say, yeah, in lieu of other questions, we'll probably call it there, but thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you to Wendy and thank you to the rest of our contributors. If you'd like to have a conversation with any of the contributors, I'm sure they'd be happy to have one. And yeah, if you'd like to get your book signed, we have a signing table just over here. So thank you all for coming out and have a wonderful evening.